Without further ado, we can handle the other stuff afterwards, but now I'll introduce tonight's speaker. Rook Hawkins is a historian of classical civilization and comparative religious studies, and also co-founder of the popular internet radio shows The Rational Response Squad and Rook's Nook. Hawkins is currently undergoing the process of peer review for his upcoming book, Discovering the Gnostics? Gnostics? A look at the gnomes. A look at the evolution of mystery cults in the Hellenistic and Roman periods. So, take it away, Rook.
So why are you all here today? I don't mean that metaphorically, but literally. So I felt it was necessary in light of that expectation that I fill you in a little secret. As part of scholarship, I often feel that scholarship exists to create problems instead of solving them. We're not intentionally doing that, but rather there is so little data to be collected that much of what we do involves interpretation. We examine the very little data that we have and draw from that data an interpretation that we consider to be accurate knowledge. That interpretation depends on the individual methods of the scholars and their reasons for collecting the data to review it. Therefore, we do as scholars is not necessarily to gather the facts, but rather to translate that data into understanding. In other words, that understanding is not granted by the data, but through the interpretation of that data. Why is this important? It is important because we, like the Hellenized Jews in the diaspora, rely on our own hermeneutical readings of the text in order to relate to them. So what makes the Gospels any different? And more importantly, what makes scholarship so much better at interpreting these narratives than you? Who is to say that what we know is really what is fact, at least in regards to history? What the interpretation of data has told us so far, for example, is that the Bible presents us a certain creation story, an exile, an exodus, a conquest under the leadership of several patriarchs, a monarchical period, another exile, a return, an additional exile, and then the coming of the Messiah followed by his death and resurrection. For quite a few scholars, they know this all happened. But that's the problem. They interpret the Bible based on this knowledge. But is it fact? For hundreds of years, this was considered to be just that, undisputed fact, that the Bible, the Old Testament at least, was exactly what it was, a historical document. The majority of scholarship agreed that the history of the ancient Near East was exactly as the Bible described it. But today, archaeology and history give us a vastly different perspective of the ancient Near East than the Bible does. So much so that the Old Testament narratives are now no longer looked at as historical books, but as literary fictions. What that also means is that for hundreds of years, what scholarship had claimed as data supported as fact was nothing of the sort. Excuse me about problems. But I digress. You're not here for a lesson on the methods of scholarship, but you probably still think you're here for a history lesson. And that is why I hope to dissuade you from thinking. This is not about history, nor is it about a historical Jesus. It is about understanding. It is not about verifiable fact, although there will be many presented here tonight. This is about the interpretation of these facts. This is about folklore. This is about legend and about how these narratives were interpreted, reused, and rewritten to reflect different times and different places. It was never about achieving absolute answers, but rather the answers are subjective to the individual readers. And perhaps that is exactly what the gospel author's intent was. It was my interpretation, which I'll be presenting today, hopefully persuasively, that the gospel narratives were written through a process of interpretation, that the authors did not believe they were writing historical fact, but they were writing interpretive fiction. And since their compositions, the Gospels have been subject to an often ugly debate on interpretation and theological nature. And this does a good job of expressing the value of my point, the fact that everyone seems to need to interpret it yet. Virtually lost to most scholars is this point. Too many feel that the answers are objective, and that interpretation of the Bible should rely on one's faith in the text as authoritative sources of historical information. But since when has any narrative been void of bias and motive? Even this presentation rests on some sort of agenda, even if that agenda is to espouse knowledge and a specific interpretation. But I will leave that interpretation up to you as we move along tonight. And this brings us to the start of the slides here. And what better way to begin this interpretive presentation than with a quote from one of my favorite interpreters, Ambrose Bierce. He writes in his Devil's Dictionary, mythology, noun, the body of a primitive people's belief concerning its origin, early history, heroes, and deities, and so forth, as distinguished from true accounts, which it invents later. Although Bierce never meant for his definitions to be taken as truth, his assessment of mythology is fairly accurate. I say fairly accurate because according to modern folklorists, a myth is not the same as what we're talking about today, which is the legend of Jesus, right? It is very important to make this distinction on a few levels. Myth is defined as a sacred narrative explaining how the world and man came to be in its present state, whereas a legend is a non-historical or unverifiable story handed down by tradition from earlier times to a particularly accepted as fact. Whereas the first several chapters of Genesis would be a good example of what a myth is. The gospel narratives focus on a specific group of characters which hold literary purpose. Now, what exactly is that purpose? And we're going to get to that purpose a little bit later as we go on through the slides. But let's look at what generic myth looks like when broken down into individual parts. Right here. Let's go. As you can see, we have 4 parts to a legendary narrative. In fact, I'm going to try to do this without looking down at the paper every 5 seconds. You have reinventing, challenging, or maintaining stereotypes. Number 2 is tropes and metaphoric language. We have moral teachings, and reusing, reinventing, and reinterpreting folklore and tradition. Now, all 4 of these play a vital role in legend development. Okay, you guys all know this movie, right? The Godfather. I'm an Italian-American myself, so when I saw this movie for the first time, it really kind of hit me. And I know from my dad and my grandfather, especially my grandfather growing up around this time period, this really hit him as well, too. This movie defined the generation of Italian-Americans. But what did it do? It took a stereotype, and it remade it, right? Michael, this guy here, Mr. Michael Corleone, who would have thought at the beginning of the movie that he would be able to handle the sort of pressure come about when he became a mob boss, right? A capo di tutti capi, as you will say in Italian. This guy right here started out as a World War II Marine, right? And he started off as a really clean-cut individual, right? No one would have expected that when his father was shot, he would be able to take the responsibility onto the family after being gone for so long. But the author of this book, it was actually a book series before it was a movie, decided to reinvent the traditional trope and make him stand out, make him appear more vital to all Italians, not only to all Italians, but all men at the time period. Made him become something he wasn't originally thought to be. And that's just one example of reusing a stereotype. Here's another. Okay, I know a lot of people often get this. You probably still hear it today. Believe it or not, racism is still a part of our society, which is a horrible, horrible thing, especially down south. And even in Pennsylvania, there's places around here. But as you can see, hood gangbanger, right? How many people have heard that stereotype about African Americans? Now, growing up in my generation, I've had to deal with a lot of African Americans. I have a lot of friends who are African Americans. Louis, check out Great and Squares, little promotion. But basically, you know, who's seen Finding Forrester? Anybody see that movie? Okay. What happened in that movie? He started out as a character, was in a hood, in the ghetto, right? An African American character, a young kid. Who would have guessed at the start of that movie that this kid was so brilliant? And then he makes an unlikely friend. Now, why do we like this character? What makes us like the character, the young boy, who excels and goes into this private school and becomes this really excellent individual? We like it because he breaks the stereotype. He breaks the stereotype and makes us relate to him. And that's, I think, one of the most important things, and I think that's why everyone enjoys watching that movie. Okay, you guys know this one too, right? Have you ever had a debate with a creationist or a fundamentalist Christian? That's what they think a scientist is right here. Guy, you know, a maniacal haircut, cackle and everything like that. Really, it's just, every scientist I know doesn't look like that. Maybe except for Mike, but that's about it. Some of you guys know Mike. Like the Einstein hairstyle, sits around in his basement mixing formulas like an alchemist in the Middle Ages, you know. I mean, this is not what a scientist looks like. So it's very hard to break that stereotype. But it's still a stereotype. It is one that we need to actually start working on. What the heck is this? Okay, well, All right, yeah, there is. This is my favorite stereotypes right here, actually, because this kind of fits my personality so well. You know, funny thing is, I wasn't always like this. But you know, of course, all that changed. But I mean, it's, you know, I love the stereotype. Who saw Revenge of the Nerds? All right, I mean, that movie is a classic. But why is it a classic? Because it takes a negative stereotype, turns it around, makes us really appreciate the characters. When they get the girls at the end of the movie and everyone turns around and is like, oh, I used to be called names when I was a kid, everyone can relate to that. It's all about relationships. It's about how we relate to the characters and how an author takes a stereotype and reinvents it. Now, all the stereotypes that you just saw, all of them come down to this really important fact, which is that when you have a stereotype and you reuse it, the author is drawing in your emotional output, right? He's making you want to like the character. In the same way, stereotypes can be used in the opposite direction, right? Who's read a book and just, you know, someone said, oh, they were in an office. Did anyone sit there and say, oh, who else was in the office with them? No, you assume that they have coworkers, and you assume that these coworkers are doing office coworker things. You stereotype it in your mind. And that's one of the most important things that an author can do too, is that he can switch around and make characters disappear. You just don't even recognize them, you don't notice them, and that's the point. You use stereotypes in different ways and you get different results. And we're going to find out how the Gospels do that later on. So, literary tropes. Okay, a trope is defined as a figure of speech such as a metaphor or allegory in which words are not used in a literal sense, but in a figurative sense. And it's not always just words, it's also whole storylines, like, you know, Aesop's fables would be considered a trope in some way. But of course you can see the guy's like, oh, good news, the test result shows it's a metaphor. Ha ha, stab my back. Okay, so. Mimesis. This is probably one of my favorite words to say, mimesis, I don't know why. It comes from the Greek, which is mimesis, it's actually a word, mimetes. And Aristotle defines it in his On Poetics, that it's actually like he describes it as a painting, or he uses the example of a play. And he says when you go and watch a play, the author will try to inflict some underlining thing in there. He'll represent something, although it won't be on the surface. It'll be underneath. Like in the movie The Day After Tomorrow. Okay, when you know, you have the vice president talking to the scientist, and the vice president looks exactly like Dick Cheney, you know, and you're like, I get that. He's trying to poke fun at the Republican Party right there. That's pretty funny. Unless you're a Republican and you like Dick Cheney, in which case it's not funny at all. You want to leave the movie. But the fact is that's the form of mimesis. It's an underlining agenda being pushed forward, or an underlying storyline. It could be anything. It could be a storyline, a person, anything that can surface to the top of a storyline. You can't see on the front, but when you look deeper, it's there. That's what mimesis is. And go ahead. So what is folklore? Folklore makes the fourth and final part of a legend building. And in fact, all these can be in a genre of their own. They don't all have to relate to legend building. I can say folklore is of itself its own sort of genre, but it's part of legend building. Especially when someone takes folklore from a group or a cultural group or a demographic and it puts it into their story, it makes a person relate more to that story who's a part of that demographic, right? You know, so I know I have some seniors that are here, and probably sure you wouldn't want to go see a movie like made for, you know, teenagers today with, you know, my grandfather says all the time, those damn kids in their movies. You know, he's always complaining, he's like, everyone's just, you know, shooting stuff, people are dodging bullets, and in his day, everyone wore suits and had $1 million, you know, so it's just one of those weird little trends, but okay. So folklore exists in antiquity. Everyone knows folklore exists in antiquity, but I want to explore it a little bit further here. The Greeks conquered the Near East, bringing folklore with them from Greece, along with Homer's epics, which is considered to be the Greek Bible to a lot of scholars, at least in the field of classical civilization. The Jews had their own folklore prior to Greeks that had already been influenced by the Persian and Egyptian folklore. I'm sure many of you have heard the Epic of Gilgamesh and some of the other tales from like the Hittites and the Akkadians and various other cultures in the ancient East, especially the Sumerians had a lot of influence on the Israelite culture. They easily adapted their legends and tales to fit Hellenic models after the Greeks invaded, and we're going to go into that as well. And when the Romans carried out their own invasion of Greece, I don't know if people know this, but the Trojans, at least in the Romans' eyes, were their ancestors. So they used to, when they conquered Greece, they thought they were liberating Greece, and they actually celebrated with the Trojans as a way of saying, "Ha, we liberated you guys from the evil Greeks, and they conquered you on Homer's Day." And actually, that's a form of Metic culture right there. The Aeneid is actually a reinterpretation or a resetting of Homer's epics and rewritten to reflect that. But in the early church, Saint Genevieve is probably one of my favorite characters, my favorite saints in antiquity. Richard Carrier is a good friend of mine. He wrote this. He wrote a whole article actually on the use of myth and miracle and stuff like that in ancient culture, and this is part of that. He writes here, in 520 AD, an anonymous monk recorded the life of Saint Genevieve, who had died only 10 years before that. In his account of her life, he describes how, when she ordered a cursed tree cut down, monsters sprang forth from it and breathed a fatal stench on many men who were for 2 hours. While she was sailing, 11 ships capsized, but at her prayers, they were righted again spontaneously. She cast out demons, calmed storms, miraculously created water and oil from nothing before astonished crowds, healed the blind and lame. Several people who stole things from her actually went blind instead. No one wrote anything to contradict or challenge these claims, and they were written very near the time of the event supposedly happened by a religious man whom we suppose regarded lying to be a sin. Yeah, can we believe any of it? Do you guys believe any of that? Okay. I don't believe any of that. And we shouldn't, he says. Now, but who else, calmed storms and healed the sick? Jesus, right? Doesn't it seem the legends get more fanciful as they keep moving forward? So here's some folklore from the Middle Ages, right? Beowulf, King Arthur, Robin Hood. People actually believe some of these characters existed as historical figures. These are just literary creations. None of them actually existed. But I can tell you just, from growing up in a city culture, going to high school in a city, people were like, "Oh yeah, King Arthur, he was a great guy, really helped out." I was like, "No, he was a character in a book." Okay. But this goes to show how powerful folklore can be. People are still believing these things today. Look at this; it's a classic one here. George Washington cutting down the cherry tree. Can you believe elementary schools still teach this? That he actually cut down a cherry tree? And that, it's and again, this is how popular folklore is. In legends, especially, that develop out of folklore, they make you want to believe in them. They make you want to relate to them. This example here is just what we're going to get into in the next slide. Pecos Bill and Paul Bunyan. These two characters, again, legendary creations, right? But they defined an entire generation of Western and rural culture in America. More so than anyone in Washington, D.C. These represented American values for at least 2 generations of people. So why does that happen? What's the mechanism that drives that? Well, that's a really good question. We'll try to get into that as well, too. So what makes Jews, Hellenistic Jews specifically, different than us today? Well, the answer is they don't. All right? Throughout history, literary tropes, specifically folklore stories, used to express an ideal or perspective or value have been told. There's no shortage of these stories, and we see them all over antiquity as much as we see them today. And just as people today actually believe in these fictional stories, many taking them as fact, so too did the people in antiquity more frequently than people do today. And again, the idea with St. Genevieve and the monk writing down these stories, obviously he believed in them, and that's why he wrote them down. But of course, today we kind of try to be more sensible about it. But then again, if you look at the populations and realize how many theists there are in the world, you probably don't make the connection. But all right, Jewish folklore. Okay, this is the fun stuff. Back in the early 20th century, there was a shift in scholarship towards the Bible being folklore. Of course, it reverted back a little bit later on, and then reverted again. But the point being is that Professor Fraser actually wrote a 3-volume work called Folklore in the Old Testament. And it's incredible work, but of course it's a lot outdated. But it just gives you some example. He actually does a really good comparative study. And then of course today, modern scholars in the ancient Near East use something called the ANET, or the ancient Near Eastern texts, which is another version that parallels the Gospels, or not the Gospels, sorry, the Old Testament. And just does a little back and forth with all the cultures. But what we have here, I have 3 points listed here. Written expression was only a fraction of the means by which Jews told their stories, which is also true for the Gospels and the New Testament as well. Many stories were recited in song, spoken poetry, and even dramas performed by actors. The folklore written or sung about depended often on the author's interests. The Old Testament is a good example of different types of folklore. For example, you have wisdom literature, the prophets, historical fiction, epic journeys, like, for example, Tobit. There's different types of ways of expressing this sort of folklore. And finally, it was common for Jews to reinterpret their own scriptures for models and tropes when creating new narratives. The third one is really what we're going to be looking at here. And I'm going to give a good example before we go to the next slide. Well, I guess we're going to go there anyway. Yeah. Just give a round of applause for Lori for changing my slides here. She's really good. Kidding. But I used Tobit as an example. And Tobit actually incorporates everything I was talking about earlier. The idea that you have an entire story, fictionalized, reinterpreted scripture, which is in Genesis mainly, chapter 23, I believe, and it also uses the Homeric epics as a model for its writing. Because in order to write in Greek, you actually have to be able to go to school, right? You have to go to school to learn to write in the language, especially in antiquity. And it is something called gymnasium, which is, we actually still use that term today, but specifically back then it was for, not only for physical education, but also for philosophy, learn rhetoric, or to learn how to write. You would actually have to go to one of these schools, and they use models to teach people how to write. And this is actually a form of mimesis. They would actually take the model, which is Homer, and reinterpret it, rewrite it to represent a new story or theme. This is very common. In fact, that's why you see so many stories resembling Homer, so many epics, especially in the Hellenistic age. And in fact, a little key fact here, next to the Bible, the most manuscripts that we have of any document is actually from Homer, Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey, and that's specifically because they used it so much in schools and education. But reinvention of tradition in Hellenic Judaism, this is from one of my favorite diaspora scholars, Eric Gruen. And he writes, the scriptures inspired reverence, but also stimulated creative energies. Hellenistic Jews found in them a prod for imagination and reinventiveness. The activity went well beyond hermeneutics. Writers recast or freely adapted biblical tales in a variety of genres, history, epic, tragedy, romance, that appealed to the Hellenized circles of their brethren. But such compositions by no means exhaust the Jewish penchant for originality. More striking and more remarkable is the frequency with which intellectuals simply rewrote scripture narratives, reinventing facts and attaching fanciful tales. The scriptures here served less as a text for exegesis than as a springboard for creativity. How dramatic is the recasting? I have a few examples up here. All right, Josephus tells this incredible story of Alexander the Great. After being denied the Jewish high priest and king for aid for the Persians, against the Persians, so infuriated he decides to march on the city of Jerusalem with the intent of burning it to the ground and killing all those who might inhabit the city. Upon this news, the high priest prayed to God, who then revealed in a dream that he must wear a specific outfit, and then tell the rest of the citizens in Jerusalem to wear white robes. When Alexander marched onto the city, he was met by the high priest in vibrant blue apparel, only to fall to his knees and weep. He exclaimed, per Josephus, that God had visited him in a dream and told him that he would make it so Alexander would defeat the Persians. And in this dream, the God was wearing the outfit of the high priest. Of course, the story is completely fictitious. We know that Alexander the Great never approached Israel, let alone Jerusalem. This is kind of really important because this happens a lot in Josephus, also in a lot of ancient writers. They reinvented entire wars sometimes just for good entertainment, sometimes for something else, for agenda, whatever have you. 2, the nature of the embellishments in Judaic texts is incredible as well. All of a sudden, Moses becomes the teacher of Orpheus. The great kings sanction and promote the Septuagint. Pythagoras and Plato learned their philosophies from the Torah and the Mitzvah. And the Spartans are held as brethren, more specifically kin to the Jews. All of these stories are fabricated, yet they come directly from Hellenized Jews. The Moses story with the Exodus grows more and more elaborate and specified. Not only do we get tales retold of the same characters, for example, Moses, Aaron, and the Pharaoh, but also are retold using the same motifs but different characters. Several different Exodus stories appear also with some very distasteful views of Jews in antiquity. Others seem rather matter-of-factly stated, while others, like those found in Josephus, actually contain very elaborately decorated accounts, which make the Jews and Moses look very pious and godly. One of these, actually, Louis Feldman, a notorious Josephus scholar, writes about how Moses is talked about being as a very handsome person, very vibrant, he glows. Why is that? Why does that happen? Well, because a lot of the Greeks tell about their heroes in the same sort of fashion. So this retelling, actually, the fact that they're reusing Greek narrative and motifs actually becomes a big part in that sort of thing. So, all right, how does this relate to Jesus and Christianity? That's what we're all here for. The Gospels resemble the same sort of scripture reinterpretation. The entire Gospel of Mark can be traced back to 5 major sources: the Torah, Homer's epics, Pauline theology, and prophetic books. Jesus is a composite of several characters himself: Moses, Joshua, which is Jesus in Aramaic, Odysseus, Elijah, and David. The name itself is a composite of the story as well. How convenient is it to be named Yeshua, or Yahweh saves, or Savior, to represent the new covenant and salvation of man, much like the Joshua in the Old Testament. So what is a gospel anyway, right? The Gospels have been falsely dubbed the genre of gospel, or good news, a genre which is decidedly Christian, not Jewish, but this genre designation takes them away from their Jewish roots, and again, which is a problem, and we're going to get into that as well. They are in fact the genre of Jewish fiction. Jewish fiction was well known to the diaspora and common locations for the opposite of Mark, which is the diaspora, and the rest of the gospel accounts. 3, they utilized legend and folklore to produce a story. Matthew, when copying Mark, makes this very clear. In fact, Mark doesn't always make it clear where he's getting his information from. Matthew kind of fills in the blanks. For example, I make a thing here where he says sometimes, and they realized he was talking about Elijah, and that sort of thing. 4, they mix historical people, places, and sometimes events to add into realism, but the readers would understand them to be fiction. Just as today, if you go to a bookstore and you pick up a book by a modern author who's using a modern time, yeah, London exists, but doesn't necessarily mean the characters do, right? In the same way, Jerusalem exists, sure. Did Jesus? Well, that's what we're here to find out. So, for example, when some Greek influence can be seen in the text, the scene with Barabbas, the crowd, does not represent Jewish people as much as it represents a chorus in Greek fiction. Mark introduces his narrative as a fiction, even citing the scripture as a basis for a story. So, and here we go. Here's a little bit of an example of what I'm talking about. This is the entire, well, more or less the entire first chapter of the Gospel of Mark. And the right-hand side, the left-hand side is the Old Testament parallels. Okay, so let's take a look here. Mark 1:1-3, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, as it is written in Isaiah, "Behold, I send my messenger before thy face. You shall prepare thy way. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight." Right? Well, look at Malachi 3:1. This is actually a composite. It's actually not from Isaiah. Either Mark didn't know where he was pulling it from, or he had a different version of the Septuagint than what we have today. Either way. Malachi 3:1, "Lo, I am sending my messenger to prepare the way before me, and suddenly there will come to be a temple of the Lord whom you seek, and a messenger of the covenant whom you desire." This is taken right from that. Right? Also Malachi 3:23, Isaiah 43, Exodus 23:20-21. Now, we go a little bit further down, and John in Mark 1:6 is wearing camel's hair robe and a leather belt around his waist. This is taken right out of Kings. Again, we see the allegory to Elijah, 2 Kings 1:8. They answered him, he wore a garment of haircloth and a girdle of leather about his loins. Also notice that the beginning of Mark doesn't have a birth narrative for Jesus. This is also really important too. We're going to get into that. Psalm 2-7 is very resemblant of Mark 1:10-11, as well as some others. "I tell you the degree of the Lord that he said to me, you are my son, today I've begotten you." And then you have God saying, with a dove descended upon Jesus, "You are my beloved son, with you I am well pleased." 1 Kings 19:8 resembles Mark 1:13. The temptation in the wilderness for 40 days, with angels ministering to him among the temptations, is exactly the same as 1 Kings 19:8, and also 19:4-7, Exodus 14:9, and 23-20. "And he arose and ate and drank and went to the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the Mount of God." So I just want to kind of reinstall the entire first chapter of Mark. I can do this with every chapter, by the way, and I wrote in my book. You can go ahead. Okay, so here we have Matthew, right? Now this is the birth narrative here a little bit here. I tried to get into it. For example, Matthew 1:18-25 resembles that of the birth of Hezekiah, Isaiah 7:14. Why Matthew chose to use the Greek word for virgin, Parthenos, instead of the Hebrew word for young maiden, Alma, is probably due to his reliance on the Septuagint over the Hebrew Old Testament. Note also how Matthew changes the verse from past tense to future tense, as in Isaiah 7:14, it's actually talking about somebody who's still in the womb and about to be born. And around that time period, it's present tense, not for the future. As with many names given to important people in the Bible, the birth of Emmanuel is assigned to Ahaz that God is with Israel. In the story of Jesus, Jesus is so named because he is the Savior of mankind, and that's exactly what Jesus means. And of course, I went to that earlier. The escape and return to Egypt in Matthew 2:13-15 and 19-23 allude to Moses' escape and return to Egypt in Exodus. The massacre of the infants of the firstborn is reinterpreted by Matthew as well. Both stories reflect a desire by God to lead his people. God feels pity upon the groaning Israelites in Egypt and sends Moses. In Matthew, God sends Jesus to bring the Israelites to salvation again, but this time it's a spiritual salvation, not actually a physical exodus and salvation. The fleeing Moses found in Exodus 2:11-23, where Moses goes to the Midian to wait until Pharaoh dies, much like when Joseph and Mary wait until the death of Herod and return to Israel. An angel appears to both Moses and Joseph in both stories to bring them back to where they are needed. And again, I show that there. And a large portion of this section of chapter 2 in Matthew is from the Exodus story as well. Okay, so here's the question: why did they write them? Right? What was the motivation? Allegorical writing and interpretation happened frequently during the Hellenistic age by Jew and Gentile alike. In fact, Philo, in his discussion of the Therapeutae, actually says that they are allegorical in almost every way. They write and interpret scriptures almost constantly, and that's pretty much all they do, is they just constantly reinterpret scriptures allegorically. But it was also done not just by sects of Judaism, but also by people who wanted entertainment, Jews who were trying to show a better face in front of the Greek leaders of the time, and even the Romans when they took over. So much like Josephus does. In fact, Josephus opens up his histories, the Antiquity of the Jews, which remarkably sounds like the Antiquity of the Romans, which is something that appeared 100 years beforehand. Basically what we have here is we have this reinterpretation of culture. Because of the static model of formal education, rhetorical and mimetic writing were commonplace. Everyone copied off of the narrative models and rewrote them to create new narratives. Influence of other cultures and the diaspora living conditions of many Jews allowed many to add new and thought-provoking creativity to the scriptures. That's what is discussed by Eric Gruen. And we're going to go into some of that too. Trade routes opened up when Alexander the Great conquered the whole Near East. And this is kind of an important part. Where traveling from destination to destination was no longer just a Homeric trope. It was actually actual reality. People had to travel long distances to achieve certain things. And inns had to be established and things like that. So traveling, along with several uprisings, led to the feeling of unrest and insecurity. And on that note, on point 4, I also want to make the point that this feeling of insecurity pushed many Jews into joining mystery cults or societies where they could travel and stay with other members of these societies without feeling threatened. Part of this trust came from the initiations into these societies. Much as baptism is initiation into Christianity and circumcision for Judaism, the mystery cults of antiquity were mainly Greek, and the Jewish sects sort of took over and reinterpreted them to make them more Jewish. And this is kind of really important too, because that kind of explains a little bit about, for example, if you read the book of Acts, the opening book of Acts, they talk about how people would get together and be kind of like a commune. They would put all their possessions into one area, and everyone would just take away from that money. It sounds sort of like the Essenes, and in fact, my book will present the case that the reason why the Essenes are not mentioned anywhere in the gospel accounts, but they're mentioned in pretty much every single historian of the day, is that because the Christians kind of arose out of this Essenic sort of tradition, this allegorical Greek Pythagorean sort of lifestyle. And I'll make that case in my book. I won't make that here because I simply don't have enough time. But that's kind of what we have with the Jews along that time period. So are the Gospels historical or allegorical? So far we've seen a lot of allegorical mimetic use with the Scriptures, and that happens throughout most of it. But actually, here's what we're going to look at here. This is what we have to decide here if we're going to make the case for allegorical instead of historical, right? If the Gospels are written to reflect some historical event, we won't be able to determine it, and you would have to say, well, yeah, if they were based on history and were written to reflect that history, it would be able to be determined. For example, we can read Josephus and clearly see that the evidence that we have outside of Josephus for the Jewish war actually took place. So you could say that, okay, well, there's evidence for this, even if he's totally fudging the numbers and making himself out to look like a hero to the Romans, probably isn't the way things actually happen. What we would like to see is very detailed accounts by authors who readily identified themselves, and who made clear their sources, who were eyewitnesses to any events, and who gave us natural accounts. And of course, we don't have any of that with the Gospels. In fact, we have unidentified sources. Mark is only an honorary name. It's not really the guy who wrote it. You also have no sources, even though we know Luke and Matthew copied off of Mark. He never says that. They never say that they did. We can even prove it by looking at the Greek, but that's another story too. We have no real naturalistic events. In fact, we have supernatural events. Jesus coming in the water, walking on water, multiplication of the loaves, which, by the way, is literally taken right from 1 Kings as well, with Elijah multiplying the ointment and the oil, and also the bread and the yeast, which it comes right from that. So anyway, number 2. What would be present in the narrative if such an event were somehow historical? That's another thing. We would expect to have a somewhat credible attempt to present a source document of the life of Jesus, some parts of the life of Jesus, not just when he was 12, he went to the temple, and then when he's gone, he went missing for like how many years, and then all of a sudden he appears again, like, hey, look, I'm back. Another example would be Arian, who was a prominent historian of the day. Actually, I think he wrote Anabasis, which is about Alexander the Great. He actually says that when he was going through his sources, they disagreed. So he put them side by side and actually allowed you to make the decision on which one was more accurate. So he didn't actually pick and choose which one he thought was more accurate. He let you decide. And that is actually what historians of the day, a really good example of a historian of the day, would have done if they were actually writing a history. Go ahead, number 3. When one went back to separate the myth from the fact, could someone successfully accomplish the task, or would they be cherry-picking verses and, in effect, be picking history? And, in fact, that's what we see with a lot of Jesus scholars today, especially historical Jesus scholars. If it can be shown that the Gospels conflict, and they do, and portray different versions of Jesus, how could one adequately determine which Jesus portrayal is accurate? And this is very important as well, because different theologies are present in almost every single Gospel. The Gospel of Mark, for example, has Jesus totally disregarding the law. He seems to be more in line with Pauline theology than Matthew's version of Jesus, who says, whoever destroys the law, I'll send you to hellfire, pretty much in Matthew 5:17-21. And also, there's also the instance where in Mark, he sends his men out, he sends his disciples out to the Gentile community. And in Matthew, he calls them dogs. So, again, we have different theologies present coming through. And number 5, one of the many Gnostic Gospels portray Jesus in different ways. Do we include them or dismiss them? And this is kind of interesting because one of the Jesus questers from the second quest, there's actually 3 quests for the historical Jesus, by the way, and all 3 of them have come to the same conclusion that they can't find Jesus anywhere. They looked and looked and looked. Apparently he's hiding under the bed somewhere. I don't know. But do we include them or dismiss them? James Robinson was, again, from the second quest. He was the one that did a lot of work on the Nag Hammadi texts, which were the Gnostic works. And he was actually the first one to introduce them into Jesus study. And I think that's really important. I think that we should definitely keep them around. And I think there's something very important to say about them, is that in the same way that from Mark to John, you have this literary legend developing. There's been some controversy there. Something's going on. They have to change the story around a lot. And in Matthew also, there's also this whole scene where there's the tomb robbing incident. I'm sure you've heard about this, where they say that someone, just be on the safe side so no one steals the body. Let's put 2 guards out front. As if that they were being accused that someone has stolen Jesus' body at this point in time, right? That's why it doesn't exist anymore. That's instead of having resurrection, they stole his body. But again, the Gospels, especially the Gnostic Gospels, continue that. This is my hypothesis on the progression of the Jesus legend and also where we are today. Judaism and Orphic traditions obviously extended prior to the Hellenistic age. The earliest reference that we have of Orpheus, I believe, is the Diverni Papyri, that's it. The Diverni Papyri date back to about 500 BCE, and they're the earliest references that I know of to Orpheus. There are also very important because they show that the tradition existed long before Jesus. There's a lot of mystery mythicists out there, Jesus mythicists like I am, who try to paint Jesus as all these different Hellenized gods and goddesses and their compilation of that. I really don't buy into that theory too much. I tend to think that that's very poorly sourced information. It's old school scholarship back to the days of Kiersey Graves, so I don't buy into that too much. I do believe, however, that Orphic traditions influenced Pauline thought, and in fact, in my book, I'll show how that was happening. The same sort of thing you find in Orphic traditions with the dualism and the spiritual resurrection. All these sort of things happen in Pauline theology. They're very prominent in Pauline theology, and in fact, we know that where Paul was teaching, Orphic tradition was very prominent. We also have evidence that Orpheus influenced Judaism, and we're going to get into that in a couple of slides in a minute here. But we have Jewish orthodoxy and Jewish mysticism coming from the Dionysus mystery cults, Orphic mystery cults, and the Zagreus mystery cults. And then Judaism kind of continued straight down. There was like multiple different sects. And then the Jesus legend with Pauline theology was influenced with the mysticism of Judaism, excuse me. And then, of course, you have the Gnostics and the Orthodoxy breaking off of that. Just so you know, there was never actually one united church. People try to say that, but if you read the Pauline letters, there's all sorts of comments going on in Paul's day. And this is only supposedly a few decades after Jesus lived and died. In fact, 10 years to 20 years. So why is it that he says all this time, oh, well, some of you are with me, some of you are with Jesus, some of you are with Apollo, some of you are with, such and such. And there was all this diversion that Paul's actually scolding them. He's like, what are you doing? You're supposed to be united. And they weren't united at all. So as far as the records are concerned, there was never one unified church. And you would think that if Jesus actually existed, that there would have been one church, because the disciples would have set them all straight, right? They'd all been with the guy, right? All these people supposedly saw him. You'd think they would have set him straight, but they didn't. So who is this character? Who wants to venture a guess? Anybody?
Paul.
Paul? Someone said Paul? Who else? Yeah. Mary Magdalene? That's actually a man, by the way. Anybody? He's got a cross staff and a halo over his head and sandals with a bunch of sheep. Jesus, you would think that, right? Actually, you'd be mistaken. That's Orpheus. The only difference is that he's a Christianized Orpheus. What you see in catacomb art, especially in catacomb art, you see a lot of Roman catacombs and being basically reinvented to fit Christian motifs and Jewish motifs. And this is just one example. Orpheus was considered to be by many to be a shepherd. He was and this is kind of why he has the lute there, and he plays it, and he brings all sorts of animals to him. Jesus kind of fills this in. But this is just one example of Orpheus showing the influence of Orpheus on Christian tradition. And now we're going to see a little bit more of that tradition here. So we have to actually establish the fact that the Jews had contact with Orphic mystery cults, right? You can't just claim it. No one ever actually claims something. And we're all free thinkers here. I don't want you to take my word for it, so I'm going to provide you with some evidence. Here are the three things that we need to establish this sort of assimilation. We need settlements, evidence of settlements inside areas that are heavily Hellenized. And I asked you, what evidence does one have of Jewish settlements in the region? What archaeological finds have been presented for this? This is the first and most important thing to establish. Can we even be sure that Jews lived among these cities? 2, assimilation and social cultural accommodation. This is the second most important thing. One must present some level of sociological assimilation and culturalization to where the Jews have lost some of their own cultural distinctiveness to the host culture, or gained some cultural distinctiveness from the host culture. And in this case, the host culture is the Greeks. 3, access to host manuscripts. This is important. Not only must a person interact daily with the host, but they also have to be able to read the manuscripts, to be able to read the Orphic traditions, other things like that. So this is what we're going to look at. By the way, that inscription is from a dedication of a synagogue found in Alexandria, Egypt. In fact, you can just barely make out the Greek synagogos, just about 3 lines up from the top. So 3 lines down from the top, but anyway, good. Here we go, another inscription. Evidence for settlements of Jews in areas where they would have had been introduced to Hellenic ideas is very strong. Alexandria was a hotspot for cultural interaction with Hellenes, Greek-speaking individuals. That's what Hellenes mean. In fact, the Greeks called themselves Hellenes, but Hellenism, for example, actually means to speak Greek or act Greek. And there was a strong evidence that many Jews would have had been assimilated in some degree or another in order to interact and live. I mean, if you have a host culture that's conquered the area and you're using their money, you're going to have to learn the language, or at least understand the language, in order to be able to live and function as a whole. This has been established textually and archaeologically. I like to use an example of the fact that I'm Italian American. I'm a third generation Italian American. My great grandfather came over from Italy, and he had to obviously function here, right? Just many of you are probably from immigrants, background immigrants have come to the United States. There's not probably a lot of Native Americans in the room. So you can all actually understand what the Jews are going through. They were in a diaspora of their own, just like you're in a diaspora now. And you function today as an American, not as whatever cultural background you come from. You use American money, you use American slang, you go to American jobs, you function with American economic system, okay, whatever have you, right? This is what the Jews were going through too, but many of them actually had been born into the Hellenistic age. They didn't just appear there one day. It was, hi, how you doing? This is actually, they were living there for a long period of time. So that's something really important to establish, that there were settlements there, that many of them had been brought up into this Hellenistic culture. Assimilation is the second part of the three things that we need to establish. On the left-hand side, that's Orpheus again. Hey, guy, how you doing? This is actually found in a Jewish synagogue dating to the 2nd century BCE. All right, but there's also not only the fact that we have Hebrew works written in Koine Greek, not Aramaic or Hebrew. There are dozens of Jewish manuscripts, gravestones, epitaphs, written in Greek, some bearing the names of Greek gods, like Dionysus, and places in Greek mythology, like Hades, the Greek underworld. More interesting, however, are the manuscripts of Jewish writers during the Hellenistic age, in which they reinvent their history and tradition to reflect positively on themselves and even attempt to establish kinship with the Greeks and Alexander, like we talked about earlier. Some clear examples will be, well, we actually did explore this. I don't know why I put that there. It's kind of weird. But anyway, next. Number 3, manuscript access. By far the most difficult thing to ascertain is whether or not the Jews would have had access to Greek manuscripts, right? And of course, religions like Homer's, epics, and Orphic traditions. But there is solid evidence for both. Again, we talked about gymnasium earlier, the Greek private school, which is for the elite class, where they would learn to write in Greek by mimesis, which we talked about earlier, or imitatio, which is imitation of Homer's epics. So they did have access to Homer's epics, and in fact, many of them learned how to write through that process of mimesis. And 2, we have a Greek poem written by a Jew with strong Jewish themes, which is entitled Orphica. It is a poem to Orpheus. These are just a few of the examples that could be given to show Jewish awareness on some level of Greek manuscripts and scrolls, and also mythology. By the way, that image on the left there is an image of a student in a Greek gymnasium learning how to write. Okay, so concluding thoughts. Where is the evidence for the historical Jesus? I don't know of any. Do you? I've never seen it. If the Gospels are not historical, where can the historical Jesus be found in them? And that's a really good question. If the Gospels are literary tropes, reinventions of tradition, okay, where is the historical Jesus in them? If you could point out a section of text which you think is historical, without being hypocritical and ignoring another section of text, please do so. I'd love to hear it. And 3, if characters like Tobit and Job and Moses could be literary inventions, and they are, why can't Jesus be as well? Especially going over the evidence we've heard today with the Gospels using literary tropes and legend creation to present this Jesus character to us. All right, and one more slide here, and then I'll take Q&A from anyone. This is how you can get in contact with me and learn more. I have a blog. I have 3 blogs, actually. It's all really the same thing. But I generally use my WordPress the most. There's my 2 email addresses, and rationalresponders.com and rookhawkins.com is how you can find me and get in touch with me. So thank you all for coming to this, and I'll take Q&A next.